good to be here again with you all, and I know we've got some guests who have been here maybe once or twice, and some guests who are here for the first time. It's good to have you with us. We are today continuing, really wrapping up a series that we began a couple months ago, focusing on the way that our Christian faith touches or impacts the areas of work and study that we are engaged in. We've talked in this series about construction and building. We've talked about medical fields, and we've talked about math and about art and design, about computers. We've talked about a number of fields of study, about areas of work, as we have looked to go deeper, thinking about an analogy I used here a few months ago, encouraging us to move beyond the lobby. If we think of Christian faith as a museum, and the real goodness, the depths of goodness in the museum is not in the lobby, as nice as it may be. It's deeper, in the galleries, in the depths of the beauty of the things that are farther in. Sometimes it can be tempting to stay in our Christian faith in the lobby. And I'm wanting to encourage us to go deeper. And so today I want to talk about my own field of study, which is philosophy. I'll talk a little bit about my journey into philosophy, but especially I want to talk about the way that I think Christian faith interacts with, the way that it touches philosophy. Let's start with a verse from the New Testament in Colossians chapter 2. Colossians chapter 2. In the first few verses of Colossians, Paul writes this: I want you to know how hard I am contending for you and for those at Laodicea and for all who have not met me personally. My goal is that they may be encouraged in heart and united in love, so that they may have the full riches of complete understanding, in order that they may know the mystery of God, namely Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. I tell you this so that no one may deceive you by fine-sounding arguments. For though I am absent from you in body, I am present with you in spirit, and delight to see how disciplined you are and how firm your faith in Christ is. Paul shares a conviction that Jesus is the source of knowledge and wisdom, that in Christ are hidden literally all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. And I think that's, of course, what would have struck the disciples as they spent time with Jesus, recognizing that he knows what he's talking about. He knows what he's talking about in fields that are deeper and better and revealing a beauty in the world and in the way that he understands God. A kind of beauty and depth that they had not encouraged before. And so Jesus, in his final commandment, of course, asks us to make disciples, teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. Jesus has a way of teaching, a way of showing us how to live that comes from a deep understanding. And he invites us to share in his understanding and to teach other people out of that depth. Jesus, of course, also tells us that we should learn to love the Lord our God with all of our mind. We love God with our mind. And in 1 Peter, Peter tells us that we should always be prepared to give an answer for the hope that we profess. We're encouraged throughout the Bible to pursue that kind of depth, wisdom, knowledge, on the model of Jesus. I never thought, it never in fact has occurred to me in the years that I've been studying philosophy. It's a lot of years. It has never really occurred to me that Christian faith is somehow at odds with philosophy. In fact, when I first came across that kind of perspective, I was shocked, even offended. So let me first describe a bit about what I think philosophy is, and describe this road into philosophy as we unpack a way of understanding its relationship to Christian faith. Philosophy first just means careful thinking. Philosophy just is careful thinking. It isn't a particular kind of thinking, even. And there are many schools of philosophical thought, approaches to philosophy, ways into philosophy, or strategies and methods for philosophical reasoning and argument. But philosophy just is careful thinking. So I don't really think it's possible to get away from philosophy unless you don't want to defend careful thinking, or you think we should be doing some other kind of thinking that isn't careful. Philosophy just is careful thinking. And in this case, it includes careful thinking about God. When I was a teenager, I came across apologetics resources and philosophers who had a level of sophistication in their presentation of philosophical arguments that related to Christian faith that I found appealing, because I was drawn to the ability to prove my atheist friends wrong. 15-year-old Ryan liked the idea of telling his classmates that they were wrong about God, that God is real, and being able to show them. It isn't a very noble motivation, but it was mine. And eventually I continued to pursue philosophy to increase my own level of conviction and confidence about my faith. And that's a motivation to study philosophy that continues to be useful to me. I started pursuing these kinds of questions in high school and in my undergraduate degree at Biola in California, where I met my wife. I spent quite a bit of time studying philosophy, and then spent time studying philosophy during my master's degree at Yale, where I came across a number of mentors who opened up a world, a way of thinking about God, a way of thinking about God's interaction with the world that I didn't realize existed, a depth of the beauty of God through the minds of those men and women who mentored me in that world. I pursued a PhD in philosophy of religion at Ankara University, the university where Emin did his undergraduate. It was the Ankara University Divinity School. At the time, I was the only non-Christian student at Ankara University's Divinity School. I was the only Christian student, sorry. The only non-Muslim student. I was the only non-Muslim student. Emin came to Christ in that faculty. But I was kicked out before I finished the PhD and had to come to Cyprus, and I'm glad that I made that transition to Cyprus, but it did mean leaving behind my studies after 8 years pursuing that degree at Ankara University, and I had to leave it behind. And then for 8 years, almost 8 years, didn't pick it up again at a university. I continued to study and to write on my own here, occasionally for magazines or for classes and training programs. But only just this year started again. I'm just beginning my second term at the University of Cambridge, where I picked up again the PhD in philosophy. I'm 47, and I've just gone back to school. But I think it's worth it. Eventually, along that road, I came to see philosophy as a way to describe the depth and nuance, the subtlety and the beauty of Christianity. A way of getting past the lie. Some of that has to do with how we understand the relationship between faith and reason. I think I can begin by saying that we should not think of the relationship between faith and reason this way. That somehow reason only takes us so far. We go as far as we can, trucking down the road of reason, and then we have to take the leap of faith past reason into things that we have to believe because we're Christians. Which I think is the way that many of my friends imagine the relationship between faith and reason. You go as far as you can go with reason, but then there are things you've got to believe, and you just have to take the leap of faith to believe them. That isn't a good way to understand faith, and it isn't a good way to construe the relationship between faith and reason. Reason rather helps us to understand God, to describe our belief in God, to describe how our belief in God relates to other things that we believe, like science. But even within Christianity, apart from very technical, nuanced, deep philosophical thinking, there would not be a doctrine of the Trinity or of the Incarnation. We don't just go as far as we can with reason and then jump into some blind nothingness. Rather, faith is trusting what we know. It isn't believing despite the evidence. Faith is not belief despite evidence. That is not faith. That's superstition. Faith is trusting what we know. Or another way to think about what faith is belief plus trust. It isn't belief despite evidence. A Christian is required to believe no irrational thing, because no irrational thing can be true. Rather, we understand reason as a tool that God has created for his creatures to explore and understand and describe his world. As a Christian, philosophy is inevitable. Honestly, you cannot get around it, because just by virtue of being a Christian, you have lots of deep philosophical commitments. You, for example, believe in the existence of God, and presumably you believe in the existence of the soul, morality, the afterlife. These are all deep philosophical commitments. The question really isn't whether you will do or not do philosophy. The question is whether you will do it badly or whether you will do it carefully. But you will do it. Philosophy, on the other hand, gives us powerful evidence and arguments for the existence of God. I don't have time to unpack those today, but I've spent quite a bit of time studying the philosophical arguments for God's existence, the cosmological argument, for example, which is an argument from the existence of the universe. I said I wasn't going to do what I am right now doing, but that the universe exists requires an explanation. The extraordinary fine-tuning of the universe requires an explanation. The temporal beginning of the universe, that time is finite and the universe has a beginning in time, demands an existence, and God is the best explanation for the existence of the universe. On all of these features of the universe, God is the best explanation. But God philosophy also gives us powerful arguments for other Christian beliefs, like the reliability of the Bible or the historicity of the resurrection. When I was a teenager, I was very focused on these kinds of arguments, evidence and arguments. And it's true, there are some things that you should only believe, Joshua, based on argument and evidence. That's a fact that I wish my flat earth friends could appreciate. There are some things you should only believe if you have sufficient argument and evidence. For example, if you want to believe that the first Neanderthal was left-handed, and you want to be convinced that that's true, you probably ought to have some really convincing evidence that I don't think exists. If you want to believe that there is in fact a cat in that box, that's a belief for which you should want evidence and argument. But there are other beliefs in fact, a great many things that we believe for which we should not and cannot demand evidence and argument. I am justified, I am right to believe, for example, that there are in fact other persons in this room besides me. There are other minds in the world, and that I am looking at a sea of faces that represent real persons. Can I make a solid philosophical argument to that fact, to that effect? I cannot. And you can't either. But am I right to believe it? I am. Or that the past is real. Am I justified to believe that the past is real? Is it possible that you were created 10 minutes ago with all of the memories of your past and the partially digested remnants of dinner in your stomach? Is it possible? Of course it's possible. Are you justified in believing that that's not true? Are you justified in believing, in fact, that the past is real, despite the fact that you cannot make a solid argument or give any evidence for it? Of course you are. In fact, most of the things that we believe in that more direct and basic kind of way. We don't arrive at most of the things we believe by a process of evidence and argument. They come to us more directly than that. We are hardwired, you might say, to believe in the reality of the past and the existence of other minds, although there are philosophers who deny that other minds exist. It's a philosophy called solipsism. There are real solipsists in the world. A philosophical mentor of mine at a distance who I've never met in person, Alvin Plantinga, wonderful Christian thinker, he tells a story about when he was a young philosopher at Wayne State University in Indiana. He heard that in the mathematics department there was a solipsist, a philosopher who genuinely believed that there were no other minds, that his was the only one. He went and had an interview with this guy and really believed in solipsism, denied the existence of other minds. When he left the office, one of his colleagues pulled him aside and said, we take really good care of Mr. So-and-so. because when he goes, we all go. We are justified, apart from evidence and argument, to believe that other minds exist and that the past is real. As I say, there are some things like mittens in the box for which you ought to demand evidence. God. Is the existence of God more like the cat in the box, or is the existence of God more like my belief in the existence of other minds and the reality of the past? Well, I think most people aren't arriving at their belief in God by argument and evidence, although some people do, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that. Most of us come to that belief in a more basic, more direct, more intuitive kind of way. And I think that generally we are hardwired for that belief in the same way that we are hardwired to believe in other minds and in the reality of the past. So that a person is justified in believing that God exists apart from evidence and argument. Our belief in God is in that way basic and direct. And more than that, we aren't just talking about what we can know about God, but talking about a being, a personal being, God, who wants to be known and whom we can know directly. That relational kind of knowing is different from knowing about a person or a cat. Having direct personal knowledge of somebody is different, and it is exactly what is at stake, what is at the heart of Christian faith, that we do not just know about God, we know God, and you can know God directly. And your faith in God doesn't have to be dependent on any evidence or argument. There are good arguments, and there is lots of evidence, but you don't need to explore them in order to be justified in your belief in God. Because God himself reveals himself to us. He wants to be known and invites that kind of personal knowing. For most of the past 2,000 years, the church has recognized the value of philosophy. In fact, the church has relied on it to describe and to develop our Christian beliefs. Until about 200 years ago. With the Enlightenment, there arose in the West a brand of skepticism and philosophical or intellectual attacks on Christian belief, so that some philosophers used the tools of philosophy as a way of defeating Christian faith or as a substitute for Christian worship. And the result was that some Christians in certain circles grew to have a kind of a fear and a suspicion of philosophy. That inspired a generation of anti-intellectual sentiment in the church. And we can trace that stream of anti-intellectualism in the 19th and 20th centuries that resulted in all kinds of evil. It also was fertile ground for the development of other anti-intellectual movements like the Watchtower Society, the Jehovah's Witnesses, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that emerged right in that anti-intellectual stream, the Mormons. The church is not suffering from too much deep or careful thinking. I promise, that isn't the danger. We are in no danger of too much careful thinking. There is sometimes a temptation to fall into patterns of thinking that are overly simplistic or rigid. We can let our concepts be so narrow that it doesn't allow for truth. And I know what I believe, don't confuse me with the facts kind of mentality. Don't fall into that temptation. Let your concepts of God expand. Let your thinking about God, your knowledge of God, let it become more subtle, more nuanced, deeper. Because that's what God is like. He isn't blunt, simple. He is complex, nuanced, subtle, beautiful. And so our thinking, if it is about God, if it is directed toward God, should reflect that. And if we are genuinely considering God, that's what will happen. You will grow in depth. If you are genuinely considering God, you will grow in nuance, subtlety, in beauty, in your thinking about Him. And in that way, it will be more worthy of Him. We don't need philosophy to know God, any more than I need philosophy to know my wife. But philosophy gives us a way of understanding, of describing, a way of exploring the depth and goodness of the world, the depth and goodness of God, in all the ways that I've described and more. Maybe you're in the room and on the fence about whether there's a cat in the box or whether there's a God. Answering the question about the cat is easy enough. You open the box. Answering the question about God is not like the question about the cat, because God is not like the cat. That sentence, that fact, it's deep enough to spend some hours and days thinking about. That doesn't mean we cannot know that God exists. I think we can. But that road is an inner road. The path to knowing God is not like the path to discovering whether there is a cat. Knowing God requires that my soul will be opened to Him, to be known by Him. I want to end with a poem about my dissertation topic. I'm writing about omnipresence, about God's relationship to space. What does it mean when we say that God is everywhere? That's not a simple thought. I hope you believe that God is everywhere. I do believe that God is everywhere. But what do we mean when we say it? That's something deep. That's a really big idea. I've been thinking deeply about that idea for a long time. What does it mean to say that God is everywhere? One of the things I think that it means is a thought called omnisubjectivity. I shared about it once here a while back. I think that omnisubjectivity is it's a consequence of believing that God is everywhere. Omnisubjectivity is the idea that God does not just know you, and God does not just know everything about you. God knows everything that you know exactly in the way that you know it. That is a mind-bending truth. Saying that God knows everything that you know exactly in the way that you know it. There are things that I can know that I say, I know such and such. I know whether there's a cat in the box. God knows what I know in the way that I know it. He sees the world through my eyes. You can't do that. None of you. My wife, I've been married for 25 years. She cannot see the world through my eyes or know a single thing the way that I know it. God knows everything the way you know it. It's a deep truth. It's called omnisubjectivity. We are finger-painted faces in profile silhouette. On both sides of a folded page, images mirrored nose to nose, mirrored images. Looking at each other across the crease, me trying to see you, truly seeing me. Only knowing you the way I know anything. I don't know anything the way you know it. And you only know me the way you know everything from there, outside, as other. But there is an other who knows everything the way I know anything. Whose eyes can see through mine and whose fingers paint the faces from the inside out, perfectly seeing you, imperfectly seeing me. Thank you.